Right now, our statues and monuments are being torn down. The real history of our country is being replaced with lies in order to push a partisan political agenda. Now more than ever, people deserve to know the truth. Therefore, I created this video to document the real, honest history of Black Americans. R1. Africa. Black people originated in Africa, settled in India, Australia, and then certain Pacific islands. Now you may note that Indians and Pacific Islanders tend to have more variance in skin color than Africans do. There's a reason for that. Africa used to be more like India. Africans had more of a mix of skin colors varying from light skin to very dark. That changed, however, with the Bantu. The Bantu were a group of blacks with dark skin. They successfully established agriculture in Africa by successfully domesticating various tropical crops like sorghum, cocoa beans, and bananas. This gave them a huge advantage over other groups and led to their expansion and domination over the continent. The Bantu, like all agricultural societies, concentrated wealth behind kings or emperors. African kings were wealthy figures who ruled over small kingdoms consisting of plantations. The workers who labored at these plantations were mostly slaves. The same would have been true at most of the farms in medieval Europe, Asia, or even the Aztec Empire. Being a Bantu slave wasn't glamorous, but it was better than being a hunter-gatherer. The Bantu kingdoms were more successful than any of the tribes of hunters they replaced. Because of the success of the Bantu people, Africa below the Saharan Desert became a continent of mostly dark-skinned people. Despite being an assortment of agricultural kingdoms, Africa never developed to the same level of Europe, the Middle East, or Asia. That's due largely to its isolation. The Saharan Desert proved to be a formidable obstacle to travel. It was so formidable that Europe only began trading with Africa when it found a way of sailing around the Saharan Desert. Technology to actually cross the desert took much longer to develop. On the other coast of Africa, sailing to India or Asia was made difficult by the Ottoman Empire, which ruled the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire was perhaps the most brutal slave empire to exist in all of human history. The United States doesn't even come close to the cruelty of the Ottomans. The Ottomans didn't enslave their own people. Slaves in the Ottoman Empire were mostly white Europeans, but also frequently African blacks. Unlike America, the Ottoman Empire did not buy most of its slaves. Instead, it obtained them through raiding or piracy. Eastern Europe was so commonly targeted by Ottoman slavers that the Slavic ethnic group became the root of the English word for slave. A common job that Ottoman slaves were assigned to was the position of the galley slave. This was perhaps the worst job that's ever existed in the history of the world. Galley slaves performed absolutely back-breaking labor, rowing large or medium ships across open bodies of water. Rowers who were too slow were whipped and often tossed overboard to slowly drown to death. Galley slaves were typically shackled in place and not allowed to get up and walk around or take breaks. There were no bathrooms, and the expectation was that if you needed to pee or defecate, you did so in place. The slaves were not given shoes to wear, and diseases would have been rampant. If you were a female slave or a young boy, you'd likely be subjected to a type of sexual slavery. This was a thriving industry in the Ottoman Empire, despite its supposed adherence to Islam. If you were a male slave who the Ottomans recognized as having talents that would have been wasted operating galleys, you likely would have had your balls cut off and made into a eunuch. The Ottomans believed that eunuchs were the ideal bureaucrats because they had no incentive to leave an estate to a family. No children meant no corruption. Surrounded by an impassable desert on the one hand and a brutal Ottoman Empire on the other, Africa didn't have as many trading opportunities as Europe. It also didn't have horses, cows, or pigs, all of which would die in its tropical climate. Therefore, many important technologies like guns and written language never made it to the African people. Part 2. Europe. When Europeans invented sailing technology that would allow them to sail around the Saharan Desert, they encountered African kingdoms that were very eager to trade for their European manufactured goods. Europe enjoyed trading with Africa, but had no interest in imperializing the continent at first. Africa's tropical climate carried diseases which Europeans could easily catch and quickly die from. Therefore, Africa wouldn't be colonized by European powers until much later, when new technologies could mitigate these diseases. The discovery of North America was a game changer for Europe. The Native American population was isolated from the rest of the world and had developed little immunity to disease. Upon arrival of European explorers, it didn't take long for 90% of the native population to die of diseases. The result of this was huge amounts of empty land that Europeans could take over and turn into productive money-generating farmland. That is, of course, if only they could get enough labor to work the land. Europe originally had a feudalist economy. Agricultural workers, who were called serfs, basically worked as slaves adjacent to specific pieces of land. Workers were rewarded for their efforts with food, livestock, and protection by a lord. Around the time that the New World was discovered, Europe was transitioning to a capitalist economy where workers were paid in currency instead of these other things. Needing labor for the New World, British capitalists first turned to poor whites. At this period of time, the Scottish Highlands were a fertile source of poor white people. The Scottish Highlands were a hilly and mountainous region of Scotland. There were few trees and forests here. Logistically, farming was difficult or not possible in this region. People who lived in this area tended to shepherd livestock like sheep or goats. Because property lines in the highlands were not clearly defined and livestock could be easily stolen, the Scottish Highlands developed a culture that emphasized honor above all. If you developed a reputation of being weak, you'd find yourself in a situation where everything you had could be stolen from you. Therefore, the Scottish Highlanders would respond to even a trivial display of disrespect in an extreme and often violent way. They'd also constantly brag about themselves. This bragging was known as cracking. The people who did it were referred to as crackers. The Scottish workers weren't enough to work all of the land in the New World. Eventually, black slaves were purchased as workers as well. The European slave buyers didn't know what to do exactly with these slaves at first. Capitalism didn't have slaves, it paid its workers. A lot of the white workers being brought over were charged for their transportation to the New World. Not knowing what to do with the black slaves, the British Empire originally treated them similarly. Once they'd paid off their transportation costs, they would become like any other worker. As time went on, the amount a black slave would need to pay for their transportation became increasingly more expensive. After all, a slave ship would have to sail all the way around the Saharan desert to pick up black laborers before traveling to America. Eventually, it became so expensive that employers dropped any pretense of capitalism and acknowledged that their black workers were pretty much nothing but slaves. Being a slave in America carried a few minor advantages over being a slave in Africa, but these were outweighed by a couple major disadvantages. The advantage that black slaves had in America is that Americans had access to more advanced technology. Therefore, there were more resources to go around in the New World than would have been available in Africa. This minor advantage was outweighed by some major disadvantages. The biggest by far was the nature of chattel slavery in the United States. Most people would consider the most important thing in their life to be their family, their parents, their spouse, and their children. Because black slaves were viewed as individual pieces of property, slave owners separated parents from children and spouses from each other. This was devastating to black slaves and clearly the worst aspect of slavery in the United States. Part 3. America. A lot of people want to pull down all the statues of George Washington and the other founding fathers. They owned slaves. They didn't end slavery. They must be a bunch of racists. The founding fathers weren't stupid. They understood that slavery contradicted Enlightenment philosophy. George Washington and the other founding fathers didn't demand the U.S. Constitution end the institution of slavery because he realized the economy of the southern United States depended on it. If George Washington abolished the institution of slavery, the United States could be invaded by the British Empire or another European power. That doesn't mean the founding fathers didn't do anything to try and help blacks. A lot of leftists will tell you the Constitution is racist because it considers black people to be only 3/5 of a person. This is a complete lie. The US Constitution only considers slaves to be 3/5 of a person, but it always considered free blacks as a full person. If alternatively the Constitution had considered slaves to be a full person, it would have given more political power to the slave states. George Washington himself owned slaves, but upon his death he freed all of them. He also set aside enough money to pay for a college education for every one of the children of his slaves. Hardly something that a racist would do. The contradiction of slavery with the founding ideas of America came to the head in the Civil War. America fought its bloodiest conflict with the most war deaths to resolve this crisis, which resulted in the freedom of black slaves. While slavery ended after the war, the black experience in America continued to be bifurcated. Due to segregation, blacks in the Southeast were largely stuck in place. In the early 20th century, Harlem became recognized as a cultural and intellectual hub in the US. Blacks living in Harlem were recognized for their great achievements in culture and American music. Black intellectuals living in Harlem, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, were also well respected. Harlem was a place most people associated with interesting ideas and culture, not crime and poverty. Following the Second World War, most Americans reached a consensus that the ongoing segregation that existed in the Southeast was unfair and racist. This culminated in the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The first effect that the Civil Rights Act had was a great migration of blacks. Prior to this act, it was dangerous for black people to try and leave the South. If they stopped at the wrong gas station that didn't service blacks, they could be arrested or shot. Now black people were free to travel wherever they pleased to. As blacks from the South started to flood northern cities, a conflict of culture soon became apparent. Blacks in the South had adopted the cracker Scottish Highlands culture of the poor whites they had lived near. The sort of culture where the slightest sign of disrespect invited an extremely violent response. Unsurprisingly then, crime rates skyrocketed in these cities with the arrival of the new blacks. This problem was further compounded by how the Civil Rights Act shifted the presumption of discrimination onto employers rather than plaintiffs. If America's companies and corporations were always presumed guilty of discrimination, it created an incentive for them to approve of and never criticize blacks or their culture. Therefore, the toxic cracker culture of blacks became sacred. If you wanted to criticize blacks, an army of white knights would always be at the ready to stand up and defend the terrible behavior of black people. Another function of cracker culture was its tendency to create gangs and gang warfare. The most famous example of this among whites in the United States was the Hatfields versus McCoy gang war that lasted several generations. Over time, white cracker culture became the subject of mockery and criticism. Crackers were portrayed as ignorant rednecks who acted irrationally. As a result, over time, Southern whites abandoned or walked back their cracker culture. Blacks, meanwhile, didn't do this because black culture was considered superior. Martin Luther King's civil rights movement was quickly replaced by the Black Power movement. The Black Panthers, an armed militia group, and other radical organizations like the Weather Underground soon displaced the non-violence of Martin Luther King. Civil rights leaders increasingly became involved in criminal activity. Violent race riots, robberies, and even assassinations started to become the new normal of civil rights. In the 1970s, the distinction between crime and civil rights was further blurred. Figures like Larry Hoover, the founder of one of Chicago's largest and most violent street gangs, the Gangster Disciples, became legendary figures in black culture. To blacks, Larry Hoover was just as important of a black civil rights leader as Martin Luther King. This is despite the fact that he was serving a life sentence for orchestrating the murders of other black people. How important is Larry Hoover to black culture? Consider conservative potential presidential candidate Kanye West's plea to Donald Trump to free Larry Hoover from prison. You know, the prison term he's serving for murdering other black people. Therefore, it's only natural for black culture to idolize black criminals. The black criminal is the true civil rights hero according to black culture. He is the paradigm of a narcissist obsessed with his own needs, social status, and personal reputation. It's why George Floyd is the perfect martyr for Black Lives Matter. The traditional white American culture is not an honor culture, but a dignity culture. According to this culture, all people have inherent dignity. Therefore, words or petty insults aren't important. That is why most whites find it bizarre that blacks would care so much about a murderer like Larry Hoover. It's why whites find it so bizarre that black people kill each other over trivial reasons. Recently, white progressives have tried to reconcile this dignity culture with the black honor culture. By doing so, they've created a new victim culture. In this culture, one derives self-value from becoming a victim. While this new culture allows white leftists the ability to celebrate people like George Floyd as some sort of martyr, it's for a very different reason than blacks. That's why it's inevitable that this contrast in culture will eventually end up dividing the Black Lives Matter movement. Anyways, this has been my propaganda-free, honest history of the history of black Americans. If you enjoyed it, please help small YouTube channels like my own by subscribing. Thank you.